This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times, no matter when.
Good afternoon. Today we're going to continue looking at the earliest parts of the narrative, both from the material record as well as the textual record. I believe I mentioned anyway, last week that the word archaeology originally meant old texts. Samuel Johnson, the great lexicographer, who wrote the Dictionary of the English Language in 1755, said, "All that we know of history, we know from books." Well, we wouldn't agree with that today, because books lie, don't they? I'm not so sure you could say the archaeological record lies, but archaeologists lie. Yes. Not necessarily intentionally, but this is why we need to balance material history, i.e. archaeology, with textual history. And because this is such a contentious subject, so acrimonious at times, that some of us become gun-shy because we fear the you-know-what that is slung around, especially, academic egos. Oh, boy, I'll tell you. I don't want to go there, but you understand, I believe, that who was it who said the feuds are so bitter because they're about nothing? That's often the truth, but today let's look at some of these narratives in context with material. I hope we can get to the question of the Exodus today. I really do. So if that happens, I'll have to go very, very fast. There's a question already in the back. Yes, sir.
It says patriarchal. Was there a matriarchal?
Yes. We'll get to that. The matriarchal didn't fit on my screen. But you'll see very shortly a slide does extend to both. However, that's not to say that it was very good for the matriarchs. But let's get there, shall we? Here, I thought I would show this. I showed this last quarter, after Eden. If we were 3 days older, we'd be as old as the hills and old as dirt. The one thing we are older isn't older than sin. All right, Adam and Eve in their later years. I thought I'd throw that in. I have another one, too, we talked last week about this idea. Remember, Adam means earth or man of earth or dirt, and sometimes red earth, Edom in Hebrew. And then remember, Eve is Hava, which means mother. So they're not really names, they're titles. Not to say that names can't be titles too, but I thought this was good too. A different narrative, another way to look at the story. And then the bad woman gave the snake the apple, and that's when our problems began. Right? Okay, well, so much for the humorous side. This is more the historical picture of diffusion of Homo sapiens, and that includes Homo sapiens sapiens, as well as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, which comes in a little earlier. And remember, where the tip of Arabia, around Yemen and Oman and all that, coming close to Ethiopia and the Afar Triangle, essentially, this area right here, this Red Sea rift opened up somewhere around, some say, 750,000 years ago, when Homo erectus may have crossed that area, because this was once connected as a land bridge. The Red Sea and all the way down in Africa is a huge continental great rift. And it's continuing to spread, such that you may recall a few years ago, in 2010, a volcano came up out of the Red Sea, right about there, because of the seafloor spreading. Continues tectonic plate boundaries separating, in this case, a divergent plate boundary. So this was a land bridge, and the Great Rift continues on down through Olduvai Gorge, Kubi Fora, all the way down through here. So there was first Homo erectus went through here, possibly Neanderthalensis, but that would be about 200,000 BP. And then Homo sapiens sapiens went up, because this was now split, and went up and then came back again and then diffused again out of Ethiopia. That's at least the current theory. But whatever the case, it's interesting that what we call ourselves, Homo sapiens sapiens, look at the diffusion from about the same region. Technologically, the spread of everything from pyrotechnology, ceramics being fired, metal being taken from raw nuggets of copper, which were high arsenic content, relatively speaking, not terribly high, but arsenic copper is the natural state. And then finally, not until probably around 3200 BCE, 5,000 plus years ago, did we actually make bronze. We started adding tin to it, so the Bronze Age began. But still, that also comes from the same basic region right here. And I thought that we would look here at the topographical map. You recall last week we talked about the four rivers coming out of the Zagros Mountains, Susa. You can still see the dry wadi here, which may have been Gihon, and the Frat and the Hiddekel, and those four rivers. It's interesting because the word Rosh means head or chief. It also means new or beginning. So we have real difficulty of knowing exactly how to read that. But whatever the case, we also recall from last week that the Rub al-Khali and the Nafud used to be savannas and green, and the monsoons used to come all the way across into the Sahara. That would have been probably 11,000 years ago. So gradual climatic change, a word we hear often now, although it may not seem so gradual in present expositions. Whatever the case, we definitely know that climatic shifts have hugely impacted human history again and again and again. So that these breaks that we call from early Bronze Age to middle Bronze Age was probably very much derivative of an aridification at around 23 to 2200 BCE. Same thing happened again around 1500 BCE. There was another a period of climatic instability. Great migrations happened. That was the end eventually of the Bronze Age. We can see 1200 and so on. There are these blips and bubbles and lacunae on the human history that we suddenly have a blank spot for maybe several hundred years, and then whole new ways of doing things, including ceramic styles and artistic depictions and so on, change. And that's why archaeologists basically come up with these different age breaks. And then, of course, the new technologies involving iron with greater ability to heat kilns and closed spaces with bellows, air pouring in without the heat escaping, which allowed us to develop iron technology and so on. Roughly 3,200 years ago, before the present. So 1200 BCE again. Now, all these changes, right? All these cataclysmic changes that human history has seen, yes? And you can say, well, that's a lot of crock. Okay, maybe so. But now, let's come to a funny narrative. This you've probably seen in Monreale above Palermo, a jewel of a cathedral in the Rogerian Norman dynasty, with the Latin texts over it, where Cain slays his brother Abel, as it says at the top in Latin. And here's the text, which is interesting. Adam knew his wife, the verb yada, to know, intimately know. Isn't that intriguing? To intimately know, yada. She became pregnant, gave birth to Cain. She said, with the help of the Lord, I brought forth a man. Not wanting to give any credit to Adam. It was quite obvious that she gave birth, Adam didn't, whatever the case. But it's fascinating to look at what happens. It says later, just verse 2, later there's a gap. She gave birth to his brother Abel. Now, what's so interesting about that? Cain, means sort of, I have acquired, I've done something great. I think ennui sets in. She realizes they're not getting back to the paradise garden anytime soon because the next son is named what? Vapor, futility. Abel means vapor, breath, futility. Isn't that intriguing? So pride comes crashing down with Abel. Anyway, notice, we're just not going to read the whole text. Cain is angry. God notices, verse 6. And then Cain ignores the admonition, goes out to the field, verse 8, 9, and kills him. And then that phrase, where's your brother Abel? I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? The Lord said, what have you done? Your brother's blood cries out for me on the ground, verse 10. You're under a curse from the ground, and so on. It opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood. Interesting personification of the earth. Well, I don't want to go into all the detail with that text. The first homicide, the human family is dysfunctional early on, clearly. And now here's the Lord saying to Cain, look, it says, the voice of the earth calls out to me, your brother's blood. And you can see the blood personified of Abel right there. And Cain looks fairly smug, looking at us, looking for justification perhaps, or some way of ameliorating his curse. A lot of art depicts this, which I don't want to spend a whole lot of time over. And notice it's the first mourning, not mourning, the first sorrow over the first family. And then, of course, this great, magnificent painting, which is much larger than what you see on the screen when you go to the Orsay in Paris, and you see it covers a whole wall of one of the galleries. And looking very much the fugitives as Cain leads his, what looks like Paleolithic family across a dry earth, jejune because he's cursed and nothing will grow for him. This person who was a farmer, which is interesting because it's a reversal of what we think of hunting, and here's a fairly carnivorous family. We usually think of the domestication of plants following because people are sedentary. Well, here clearly we have wanderers and not sedentary people at all. But whatever. I've written a bit about that article if you want to look it up. If you just put my name, Cain, Frederick Cormon, or whatever, there's an article you can find about that. Now, you've all been to St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, and you've seen these medieval mosaics. And here you have Noah, and he's taking the animals 2 by 2 into the ark, and obviously for reproduction purposes, male and female, 2 by 2. It's an interesting phrase, and I'll come back to this. Irving Finkel, my good friend at the British Museum, has shown that one of the earliest texts in the Sumerian shows that phrase has been repeated in the flood texts for, again, 4,000 plus years. 2 by 2. It's a very old phrase. Anyway, some of those animals, like the lions that Noah's carrying, look a bit like paper mache cutouts, or don't they, or whatever. Then you see the snakes up on the upper right, and they're actually mating in that image, which is the image of Hermes Caduceus, the Caduceus. It's mating snakes. Earth power. Anyway, now here's the whole point about this. Notice 2 of every kind, this very, very old phrase. You all know that this story of Genesis was also, while it may be considered by Western European Judeo-Christian narratives as the earliest flood narrative, it's by no means the earliest, because, and here we're told that Noah's ark landed on Ararat, That may not be the best translation. The whole word, Urartu, depicts the northern Zagros Mountains as they're coming from Iran. That's a picture I took out my airplane window last year on my way to Iran to receive anyway, I won't go into detail, but that's meant Ararat, clearly an andesitic cone volcano, but the Urartian province extends hundreds of miles down south along the Turkish, Anatolian, Iranian, Azerbaijan border, and those Urartian mountains connect to the Zagros, where, according to earlier texts than the biblical record, earlier by at least a millennium, we have the flood tablet of Gilgamesh. And this is in the Assyrian version, but it goes, as I said, all the way back to Sumerian. And notice this Urartu Massif includes the North Zagros, and this is the Gilgamesh tablet this is tablet 11. It's in the British Museum, and Gilgamesh is mentioned right down here in the text. That's one of the first mentions of him. He was the king of Uruk, or Erech, a very, very early Bronze Age city in the south of Iraq today along the Euphrates. And in this text it says, and you can imagine William Smith, the person who discovered this tablet at Nineveh in 1872, and he's reading it for the first time, reading the hoard of the archives of some 30,000 plus tablets that are now housed in the British Museum, curated by my good friend Irving Finkel. But in any case, Smith was reading this, and this is what he read. That Utnapishtim was told by the gods, Anu and Enlil, to build a boat and to put his family in it and all the animals 2 by 2, and that the rains would happen, and they did. They rained for days upon days. The whole earth was destroyed, mankind and animals, except for Utnapishtim and his family, his wife and sons and their wives. And then finally, the flood, the waters subsided, and Utnapishtim let out a raven. And it went, and it came back because there's no place to land. He let out other birds, and finally they didn't come back, or something came back with a little bit of green sprig and so on. The water subsided, and there he was on the top of Mount Nisir in Urartu. Sound familiar? Well, it reads very close to the biblical narrative of Noah in Genesis 6 through 9. In some cases, word for word, especially things like the 2 by 2 sequence. So, William Smith, when he was reading this for the very first time in 1872, he was running around the Mesopotamian tablet room of the Assyrian Royal Library in the British Museum, and he was so excited he was ripping off his clothes, and he ended up running around naked. He was just so excited. That's a famous story and true. But anyway, you can imagine he realized the significance of this tablet, that it sort of would overthrow the Noah story, or at least predate it by millennia. At least one millennium. And so this was such a parallel motif that it was very hard to ignore that there was an earlier account of the flood than in the Bible. Well, here's Mount Nisir in the Zagros. This is southern Urartu, same massif as Mount Ararat, which really shouldn't be Mount Ararat. It should be just Urartu Massif. And pretty hard to perch a boat on top of that needle-like peak, but oh well. And then, of course, here's Irving Finkel with his new Atrahasis tablet, which interestingly says that the ark was a coracle, round and 220 feet wide, and so on. And I've held that tablet in Irving's office, and so on. He has a book which I urge you to read, The Ark Before Noah. It's a bestseller, and of course, with that encomium from the New Yorker, how could you not want to read it? Anyway, I suggest that he has some wonderful narratives in the book. He's very, very has that dry British humor. He recommended that Mesopotamian cuneiform be taught in all the British schools, and said, funny, they just haven't. They haven't followed my advice yet. Anyway, Now, here we're going to jump to something else a little later. You all can recognize a geological map, yes? And you can recognize the hot colors are generally igneous rock, ignis, fire in Latin, and some of the other very interesting color spectrum rocks are metamorphic, and then you have the very obvious pastel colors of sedimentary rock. And you see, of course, that Egypt is right on that rift zone, being ripped apart. So a lot of volcanic and igneous rock from magmatic emergence and plutonic emergence. So that's a rift zone there. The Elbrus Mountains here, lots of earthquakes across this area, plate areas, and then of course this here is what was ancient Urartu, from here to here. We know that was Urartu because it's on Assyrian maps as Urartu. And the Assyrians never quite took over that area, very mountainous area, obviously. But what I want to draw your attention to, other than the Zagros down here, and you have some wonderful igneous quartz right here, the red igneous granite quartz, next to serpentine. Those of you who are auriferous geologists know when you have quartz bathyllus adjacent to serpentine with contact metamorphism, what do you find there? I heard it. Gold. That's the auriferous zone. Highway 49 in California, same thing. What's our state rock? Serpentine. So we know this, that gold is found on the quartz serpentine border. And what's interesting about that too is that's right about the land of Havilah, along that river Kidron, where we probably had that story in Genesis 2. Now, more important is right here. The Tigris River, the Euphrates River, this is a huge alluvial floodplain. Sometimes in floods, the sediments, the alluvia, can be found, as in 80 feet thick. And there's no rock to be found here. You don't build with rock here, and you don't write on rock. What do you use? Mud, clay. And it's a dearth of rock right here, which makes Lagash, Gudea of Lagash's importation of diorite from here for his famous statues at the Louvre and the Met and the British Museum all the more intriguing. But this is all alluvium, all mud. And so what do you build with and what do you write on in the ancient Near East of Mesopotamia? Mud, clay. Clay is the end product of erosion in tiny particles. It's found where we live in the riverine end product areas. And of course, this is about all you're going to get made of stone in the early Mesopotamia, are tiny little seals of imported stone, because you don't make sculptures with it. You don't find it big enough in between the Tigris and Euphrates. Instead, what do you build with? Lots of mud brick. This is Babylon. General Robert Ostenberg gave me that picture. That's the erosional mud brick when it's not terribly fired. You can see mud brick everywhere. In fact, if you go to Baghdad, most of the buildings in Baghdad pre-2003, the core of many buildings in Baghdad and all over Iraq is mud brick, still today. It's the same medium because you don't have a lot of rock, so you build with clay. So that takes us to our next text. Yes, what do we have here? The famous Peter Bruegel the Elder Tower of Babel. Of course, Peter Bruegel the Elder didn't go to Baghdad, but he went to Rome, and hence his Tower of Babel is a pastiche of the Colosseum repeated over and over and over again. Now, the Tower of Babel, interesting story. Let's go there, shall we? You have Genesis chapter 11. This is the King James, so you can take it with a grain of salt. But notice the plain of Shinar, we know, is Sinaa. That's the area around Babylon. And it says, "Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and slime they had for mortar. Well, that's King James. That's not a way I would spell mortar, but anyway. Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach into heaven. Let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth, which sounds a little bit proleptic, a little foreshadowing. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men built, and the Lord said, behold, the people is one. They all have one language. And this they begin to do now. Nothing will be restrained from them, which they've imagined to. Go to, let us go down. And there confound their language. They may not understand one another's speech. And so on. So the Lord scattered them abroad. What's so interesting about this? This is the King James. Let's look at the Hebrew as well here. Notice there is sinar. And notice, let us make here. Let us make bricks. Now notice, let us make in the cohortative here. Let us make here. You can see the lamed, the beit, and the nu. Laban is the same root word as brick. So bricks are things you make. Do you see that? Let us make bricks. Do you see it's the same word? Okay, right there, the triradical, the lamed, the beit, and the nun is right there again. The lamed, beit, nun. So bricks are what you make. It's sort of obvious, a bit eponymous, reductive. But anyway, now burn them. So here's the root word to burn right there. The sin and the resh and the peh. Do you see it? S-R-P-H. To burn. Saraf. Burn them, burn them. So there it is again. You see, saraf. So burn them thoroughly just means burn, really burn them. Burn them, burn them. That's the way you get the Hebrew superlative. It's like King of Kings or Song of Songs or Mother of Mothers or Battle of Battles. That's basically what's going on. They're really burning them, meaning high-fired brick, high-fired clay. So now, and what word do we get from this Hebrew word saraf? An angel in the plural, a saraf, is a burning one. Yes, so seraphim, burning ones. Anyway, now, next, and because they burned them, they really fired them. You know, it's really saraf. So they burned them, and so the brick was to them stone, because they're vitrifying the clay particles together, meaning they had to achieve a temperature of probably close to 900 plus degrees Celsius to vitrify clay when it bonds. Those of you who know your chemistry can confirm that. Now, they had brick for stone, the things they made. There it is, Laban, Eben, brick becomes stone. So you see the double dative here, 2, le. And then notice, remember the King James said slime they had for mortar? What's slimy and sticky? Well, here, the mortar is what we call hamor. It's asphalt, of which there's plenty in that land. Yes? Lots of petroleum products. Yes? So that was in fact their mortar, was the tar of asphalt, of petroleum byproducts. And so hamor then becomes mortar. So notice again, the word asphalt becomes the word for mortar. You see it? There it is again, for mortar. You see it? Hamor. So, what's intriguing about this is that my mentor at Berkeley, when I was a postdoc there in Near Eastern Studies under Professor David Stronach, the world's greatest Assyriologist perhaps, and a Achaemenid scholar, excavated at Nineveh, Pasargadae, Cyrus's palace, and so on. When I was, as his postdoc, I said, David, let's look at this passage. What do you think about this? And he was very pleased that I saw this. He said, Patrick, he said, this is exactly what we find in Mesopotamia in the early Bronze Age. Petroleum products used for mortar. Isn't that intriguing? All right. So, now, you've got tar for mortar, and then so on. So they're going to build this city, and I'm not going to go back to the Hebrew, except that there's no board for me to write on here, but they built this tower, and here, notice, they built the tower, the Lord scattered them, their language was confounded, they spoke one speech and it was confounded, which is A very reductive way of saying language dispersal. But notice, the Lord scattered, and therefore the name of it, this place, this tower, was called Babel. Now, today we use the word Babel from that, don't we? But the Hebrew, Babel, Bob, those of you Hebrew speakers can confirm this. How many Hebrew speakers out there are there? Somebody went through bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, yes? Okay, you confirm that I'm telling you the truth. Bab in Hebrew means gate. That's right, as it does in Arabic. Gate. El is God. It means the gateway to God. They were getting a little too close for comfort, maybe, whatever. But that's exactly what Babel means, is the gateway to God. And then it becomes the gateway to God. Notice that the redactor, editor, writer of this text is giving a hermeneutic interpretation, saying that this now does not mean gateway to God, but confusion of language. Isn't that an intriguing gloss, or marginalia, or Haggadic midrash? So fascinating, isn't it? Because what we know is that this was indeed the place of Proto-Indo-European language dispersal. Now, here again, going back to the technology areas, there's so many things that diffuse from this core area, and here is the Paleolithic diffusion of what we call one of our most common DNA. If you think of R1b, that's part of a haplogroup, and we're part of that, many of us today. Notice where it comes out of. R1b comes out of this area right here and diffuses outward. And anytime you see these colored blotches, they're sort of generic, aren't they? But notice, R1b, the most common both Ashkenazim and Indo-European root DNA core commonality. I'm sure almost everybody in this room has R1b. Did you read yesterday's disclosure about the Ashkenazim coming out of Turkey too? Anybody? Yeah, anyway. So these maps suggest that somewhere in time, it's hard to say exactly when, but it would have to be at least 11,000 years ago. And then here are Maria Gimbuta's linguistic dispersion model and Lord Colin Renfrew's linguistic dispersion model. Both of them. This one comes out a little higher. The Gimbuta's model is higher, 4000 BCE, coming out of just around the Ukraine area. But the Renfrew hypothesis is from right here. A language migration coming out of this area, roughly geographically equivalent to Babel. Isn't that also fascinating? I just talked to Lord Colin Renfrew in January at the Archaeology Institute of America convention, where we were both, he was giving a keynote speech and I was just giving a paper. But this Renfrew hypothesis of Proto-Indo-European, that's what pi means, seems to fit again in some way this story out of Genesis 11. Now, let's go to the ziggurat of Ur-Nammu. Many say this is the Tower of Babel. It's just south of Babylon today. Now, what you see has to be clarified. There's a big mud brick core of unbaked brick, and it's got rubble all around. That's the real ancient part. What you see put around it was nicely redone by Saddam Hussein. But it's still pretty easy to know what it looked like archaeologically from the core outward. And here are two views of it. There's one planimetric view of what it looked like, the sort of curved axis approach that you go upstairs. And what is this ziggurat? The Akkadian word is zikkurat, double Q without a U, zikkurat. And here's another view of it that I started out with today as my lead picture. It was mud brick, and basically what these are for is to project upward from the plane, because it's archaeoastronomy. The people of ancient Mesopotamia were watching stars and their movements and constellations and sun and moon early on. They could roughly identify when the sun was in the middle of the landscape for the solstice. They could roughly talk about the equinoxes, as well as whether winter solstice or summer solstice and the equinoxes in between. They could roughly pattern that. Women probably were the first timekeepers for calendrical purposes, identifying, as Schleim says, that women, because of menses, were able to keep pretty close clock with a lunar cycle, and so on. But sun and moon, but stars are even better, aren't they, as they move across the sky? So where is Orion right now in the night sky about 9 o'clock? It's almost sinking below the western horizon. But you watch these constellations, and that's how you know what month it is. The sun, as well as the moon and the stars. So people were using these ziggurats as astronomical observatories to get above the ambient light and smoke of the dwellings along the plain. If you're down at ground level, you aren't going to see so clearly. So you get up hundreds of feet into the air to more closely observe the sky. Why? Well, it's very obvious. Everybody knows when to harvest a crop. It's ripe. What's the difficult part? When to plant it. And that's why you need, because if you miss it by a little bit, particularly in a marginal aridifying area, you're dead. So they had to get it right. They had to know when to plant their crops, and that's what these are. Now, so everybody knows this word or phrase, yes? Mazel tov. Whether you watch Fiddler on the Roof or not, you still know it, yes? Mazel tov. Usually it means good luck, yes? But in actuality, we know where it came from. As Irving suggests, and others have suggested, and I've said this too for years, that Matzal originally means star or asterism or constellation. So what it really means is have a good horoscope. That's what it originally meant. Have a good horoscope. If you look at the phrase, there we go. Ma'atzal is constellation or asterism. Mazel tov. When the Jews went into Babylonian captivity around Nebuchadnezzar the second time, the pervasive astronomical observations of the Babylonians became very influential, and so people just adopted this. Mazel tov, good luck, but originally, have a good sky, have a good horoscope. All right, now, so you have Ma'atzal, constellation, asterism, or stars. All right, now let's move to one of the key elements today, matriarchs as well. Notice I did put it in, sir. Patriarchs and matriarchs. But patriarchalism, as a way of life, meant male dominance. And it was pretty much something, if you look, here are some of the parallels. The linguistic evolution, we know from satem, which is the Sanskrit word for 100, as well as centum, the Latin word for 100. Indo-European languages dispersed east and west from basically around the Zagros, between Mesopotamia, Iraq, Iran. They dispersed west towards Europe and east towards India. And the word Aryan is the same root word as Iran. And the Perisa, which is a root word for Persians, were the horsemen. And they carried those languages all the way to India, where in the Vedic accounts they displaced the earlier Dravidians, who then displaced became migrants, nomads, hence gypsies, the Zigeuner, the Romani. And eventually the Vedic hymns talk about the charioteer of Krishna. If you've read the Bhagavad Gita, as Max Muller explained, what is the charioteer of Krishna? What is his name? Arjuna. Well done. Arjuna is the same root word as Aryan, Aryans. So, anyway, we could talk about linguistic evolution till kingdom come. But then you have this flood account that I mentioned, the Noah Utnapishtim accounts, or the Atrahasis account, the earlier Akkadian account that Irving Finkel just published last year. Now, teraphim. Teraph is a small idol. It's a small house shrine. And essentially, I'll try to remember to bring some. They're very small little bronze or clay god or deity figurines. And if you're a nomad, you're not going to haul around a 12-foot statue wherever you go. You have small mobiliary house shrines. And you can easily, as the account of Genesis 31 says, where Rachel hid the household god from her father, remember Laban, and she put it under her camel seat, because it obviously could be hidden easily, and then she said, I can't move because I'm in an uncomfortable time of the month. And so she got off with the household gods, the teraphim. These are very common all the way across the ancient East, these small little mobiliary clay or metal shrines, household shrines for nomadic peoples. Now the word Abram, and the word El occur in a lot of Semitic languages. Ebla, for example, the great Syrian French excavations in the 1980s prove that the word Abram and El both occur in Mesopotamia from at least 2300 BCE onward. Abram, remember, in Akkadian, which is the parent Semitic root language for even Phoenician, Ugaritic, and Hebrew, Abram means father of a people, Av-Ram. And El is the chief word for God. In fact, if you look at the Canaanite and the Phoenician pantheon, the chief god of the Phoenicians is also El. So there's a lot of parallels. We could go on and on. Bride price. As I said, it was a bit patriarchal. When you read the account of Eleazar going for Abraham to find a bride for his son, goes all the way back to the family in Haran and finds Rebekah and offers a bride price and puts a seal with a signet ring and so on. Mohar is this term for bride price. Another interesting one is the prevalence of the continuity in a land, especially an alluvial land often overrun with mud and flood. You have huge stones that mark your field boundaries because they're unlikely to be moved if there's an inundation. They're called kuduru. I'll show you one in a minute. Then the eye for an eye, the lex talionis, which, by the way, did you read yesterday that a certain candidate whose name shall not be mentioned says that his primary biblical verse is an eye for an eye? I don't want to go into his despicable campaigning, but that's his one verse that he remembers. Did you read this too? Anybody? Okay. Pardon? Where did I read this? This was all over the news 3 days ago, just before a certain person. Anyway, never mind. The one who shall not be named, right? Anyway, now the legal codes of Hammurabi, which you can see at the Louvre, from 1753 BCE, 18th century BCE, that talks explicitly about this idea. If something happens to this person, then the retribution has to be equal. Compensatory mechanism. Lipit Ishtar, the Code of Ishtar, they all have these eye for an eye. Law of equals is what the Latin means, lex talionis. Now you also have a lot of fertility cults with goddesses. Ishtar, remember, is the primary word coming out of Akkadian for our word today that we use, one of the oldest words in all Indo-European languages. Ishtar is the planet Venus. Ishtar is the word star. Becomes Astarte, becomes Aster, becomes Stella in Latin with the LR, problem. And it's still the planet Venus. So Ishtar, and then you have Astarte, and you have these other goddesses, Asherah, which means the woman or the one female of blessing, Asher-ah. You have all these fertility cults that you read about in the Pentateuch, the Torah as well. Then you have the Western expansion, Amuru. Remember, the Amuru is the Akkadian word for the Westerners. Amorite is the Greek word in the Septuagint, and Amorim is the Hebrew word. It's all the same word. They went west, young man, go west. And they did, said God to Abram. Anyway, the Amorites. And then you have this bearded male dominance. You read all throughout the biblical record and the Bronze Age how Plucking someone's beard is a no-no. It's an emasculation because of bearded dominance. And you still have this today, don't you, this bearded dominance. In fact, if you're an Urdu or Pashtun, or if you're, hate to say it, if you're a jihadist, you're going to probably wear a beard because you're a man. Oh, well, never mind. I'm not going to go there. But we'll come back to that. And then you have water rights and the fights over them in an aridifying land. We'll talk about Gudea in a minute. Now, all these parallels that I want to talk about, the biblical texts as we have them have been edited. That technical term is redacted. They're all Iron Age texts. What was called the Deuteronomic revision, and now may not be. It may be earlier, as we saw last week, that probably Hebrew pre-existed in a literacy throughout Judea at a much higher rate than was thought. But whatever the case, it's still Iron Age. So the texts themselves, the Hebrew and Aramaic texts, are Iron Age texts. But the picture they describe is Bronze Age. Hundreds of years older. Isn't that intriguing? What does that tell you? For a linguist, it's pretty strong proof that what was described in customs and pictures and rituals and rites and everything from architecture to language, all those things are described, the cultures that are described are older than the language which describes them. Am I making that clear? So you have a Bronze Age cultural background depicted in the biblical texts, far older than the actual words that have written them down because the words have been redacted. Either orality or language has changed. We do this. We constantly, we don't read Shakespeare, do we? Do you read Shakespeare in the folio 1611 English? Do you? Really? Good luck. What have we done to them? We've redacted them. We've made Shakespeare a little bit more accessible. So usually we're reading 17th to 18th century English as opposed to really early 17th or late 16th century English. We've redacted them. We do this all the time. So I just want to make this really clear. This is probably the most important slide or image for today. The texts are not as old as the cultures they're very carefully describing. Detail for detail for detail. So somebody edited them. Somebody redacted them. We do have some old pastiches and old words. Sometimes the fragmentary accounts in Genesis 1, in fact, the way it starts out, Bereshit bara Elohim. Bereshit starts off, Beit Resh Aleph. Bara, the verb, starts off, Beit Resh Aleph. It's a word play. You have these ancient word plays, which were probably mnemonic. There were some oral texts, which then are surviving in the later written text. But I don't want to go into too much detail about that. I could, but we have much more to cover today. Let's go on. Here's a kuduru. Here's an Elamite boundary stone. It's big. It's heavy. I don't have a scale in this picture, but it's the size of my daughter's Bernese Sonnenhound, a big dog. Comes up to your waist at least. So if it rains and there's a flood, it's not going to move that stone. So the injunction to Mesopotamian and later in the Bible, because a lot of Hammurabi's code ends up in Exodus, this boundary stone. Do not move your neighbor's boundary stone, says Deuteronomy 19:14. If you read Gwendolyn Leake in her Historical Dictionary of Mesopotamia, she shows very clearly that the kuduru, the boundary stone, is emphatically a Mesopotamian source tradition. And notice at the top of this image, you've got the gods watching. So there is seen, the moon. There's Nergal. There's Shamash, the sun. There's Ishtar, Venus. So the gods are watching. And what are they doing? If you move your neighbor's boundary stone, may scorpions infest your children's bed, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So there are curses on these if you move the boundary stone, just like you have in Deuteronomy 19:14. A lot of borrowed customs, a lot of Bronze Age. Here's Gudea, the Louvre statue of Gudea, king of Lagash, Neo-Sumerian king, right there. And he's the first one to create parallel canals joining the Tigris and Euphrates. And it was said of him, he who controls water controls life. Intriguing, yes? Especially today. Now, Gudea is holding the Tigris and Euphrates. Do you see them flowing from his hands? There he is, in a diorite statue, one of the first stone statues. Remember, the stone had to come from way down here in the horns of Macron. But here he is, and he's probably a priest, king, but he's holding the two rivers. Literally, he's controlling life. He's controlling the waters of life. All right, water rights. Remember, Isaac's fights for water rights. And where was this? You recall south of Hebron. And what was the town's name where this happens in the book of Genesis? It's the area of 7 wells. Hebrew, the word for well is be'er. The word for 7, from which our word 7 derives, Sheva. Be'er Sheva, the place of 7 wells. And Isaac was fighting with the locals over water rights. Why? Well, especially in an increasing aridifying landscape. Now, I don't want to go into all the details, but let's come down to here for a moment. So what we actually see, if you looked at a chronological distribution of these cities, the oldest ones are down here. Eridu, Uruk, Ubaid, these are the oldest. And gradually, new cities are built along the Tigris-Euphrates. And it goes up progressively from 5th millennium to 4th millennium to 3rd millennium, and then they continue going upriver. You don't have to believe me on that, but you can check it out yourselves if you wish. Now, here's an interesting text. Ends with Genesis 11. So you have Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife, and together they set out from of the Chaldees to go to Canaan. You just saw that city, yes? And they came to Haran, and they settled there. Now, Haran isn't on this map, but it's roughly up the Euphrates in the Syrian, near the Syrian-Lebanon border up here. So they went from northwest up the Euphrates, and they settled for a while in Haran. And notice, the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, your father's household, to the land I will show you. I'll make you a great nation and bless you. I'll make your name great, you'll be a blessing. I'll bless those who curse those who curse you. All peoples of the earth will be blessed." There's an interesting historical aside here. It has nothing to do with archaeology, but I just want to make a little point. Anti-Semitism is a horrible thing, but there's an obverse that when Jews are welcomed into a land, I think you could make a strong economic case that the more they're welcomed, the better the economy will become. I'm going to be really provocative and step out on a limb. If you look at history and see this, where Jews are welcomed into a place, there's a concomitant rise of economic wealth that goes with that. Tell me, what was the height of British Empire in the 19th century when the sun never set on British soil? Who was Prime Minister in Britain? Benjamin Disraeli. I could go on and on and on about this, but a single citation of one case isn't going to make my point. But I urge you to look at this historically, that when Jews are welcomed into a land, and when they are in their full rights as a part of that culture, that land will be blessed. Many people say that that's this interesting sort of derivative idea there. I don't want to go into too much detail. I just thought I'm going to go out on a limb and say that, be provocative. But anyway, so Abram went as the Lord had told him. Lot went with him. Abram was 75 old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarah, Lot, all the possessions they came to the land they'd acquired in Haran. They set out from the land of Canaan and arrived there. So in other words, they went up from to Haran, and then they went down. They didn't go through the Nephud Desert. Let's go back to that image. This is the Nephud Desert and the Golan volcanic desert. They didn't go across it. Very few peoples have crossed that desert. Only people like the Nabateans knew where to find the oases. So the standard progression, the standard movement was up and over like this. You could go this way too, but this is what we call the Amuru, the expansion to the west. Now here you see it. Here, I didn't make these up. These are standard historical maps showing this northwest expansion partly. This is the route that Abram took, and went down here, and this is what you see. The Amuru become these westerners. They go down to here, and they settle in the Levant. So Amurim is the Hebrew word. Amuru is the Akkadian Semitic word that you would see in Akkadia and Old Babylon. And so Amurim is what you read when you read it in the Torah. And then when the Torah is translated under Ptolemy in the Hellenistic age, Amorim becomes Amorite, and they become the Amorites. So, I don't want to go into too much detail about this. This is just the sacrifice of Abram, of his son Isaac. It sounds pretty horrific, and I'm not going to go into detail about the parallels yet. I'll come back to this parallel with Baalism in a week or two. But I just want you to note that Abram takes his son, sets out with two of his servants. They go to the region of Moriah, and so on. And then Abram binds his son, and so on. And the angel of the Lord stops him. Don't lay a hand on the boy. And now I know that you fear God because you've not withheld from me your son, your only son. And then Abram looked up, saw in a thicket there a ram caught by its horns. He took the ram and sacrificed it instead of his son, and so on and so on. Well, and then you have that repetition of the Abrahamic blessing, or what's sometimes called the Abrahamic covenant. Now, Caravaggio, of course, painted this. And Caravaggio is a biblical expert. Caravaggio really knew, because he knew how to read and write, and he lived in the house of Cardinal Francesco Maria Bourbon del Monte. They're now the House of the Senate in Rome. There were plenty of texts around, so here's Caravaggio's depiction of that story. That's Cecchio, Caravaggio's houseboy. Some say bedmate, but whatever. That's probably the Castello di Pontentino, which was owned by the Caravaggio family. By the Bourbon del Monte family, connected to the Caravaggios of Milano. They're the two servants, you see. And this looks pretty nasty. There's the angel. Caravaggio loved boy angels, but anyway. There's the consternation on Abram's face because he really doesn't want to do this. And not only does he not want to do it, you can see the sort of worry about what's going to happen to his patrimony. And then, of course, his son Isaac is even more disturbed by it. They're the two servants. But look at what Caravaggio does. He highlights the edge of the knife there, you see? Dark there against the white flesh and light there against the sleeve. Genius, yes, for sure. Anyway, Abraham doesn't sacrifice his son. And of course, there's the ram in the thicket. And that's what is sacrificed instead. Now, in the British Museum, Wallace Budge, E.W. Wallace Budge, the keeper for years, said this was the ram in the thicket. This statue, which we know now is the ram of heaven, copulating with the tree of life. It's Dumuzi with Ishtar, and the copulation brings us about. So it's not at all, and it's been modified slightly so that the membrum virile is not quite so obvious now as he's mounting that tree. And it looks like the flowers have fallen off too. But anyway, you can't quite see it so well there. The ram in the thicket is not the ram in the thicket. It's Ishtar in Dumuzi. Now, speaking of that, yes. Well, that's prefatory to where we're going next. Because the biblical record is, in fact, a story of lots of murder and mayhem and incest, isn't it? All the taboos are broken. If you were in my class last semester, you saw these. But here's the story, of course. Remember? Lot and the land of Sodom and Gomorrah. And you do have places that show both sulfurization and what's called brimstone there are a lot of these cities, these two at the south of the Dead Sea, which no longer looks like it used to. Today in Jordan, these two sites show that in an area which has plate tectonic bounding separation volcanoes, you're bound to have a rain of sulfur once in a while, and a rain of what's called sulfur, brimstone, literally, as well as all kinds of problems that come from living in a volcanic area. Whatever, we then have the story of Lot and his daughters, which sounds like what? He's going backwards in time. He's going back to pre-Neolithic to live as the Paleolithic people did in caves. So it's a textual suggestion that this degradation of human culture takes us backwards, not forward. Anyway, so the two daughters take their father. This is probably a dirty old man fantasy, but again, it's predatory, isn't it? Yes? Don't you love New Yorker cartoons? Yeah, that's all I show. But anyway, so there is Lot and his two daughters who they say, look, we're in the mountains and the world is destroyed. They saw the destruction in the text. Let's go back. They saw the destruction. They said, look, our father's old. There's no man around here. So we have to get our father to be drunk and then sleep with him and preserve a family line. Now, one of you told me last quarter that alcohol is not the best inducement for fertility because, as Falstaff says, what? That wine increases the desire but decreases the performance thereof. Anyway, so there they are getting their father drunk. It's the onus on the women, isn't it? Not on him. Not that he's going to be completely scot-free here, but here is a very drunk Noah celebrating with his daughters and getting a little bit, getting a little bit fresh there with his daughter because his inhibitions are lowered. And the story goes on. This one shows him maybe a little bit more complicit in the Goltzius picture. Does he look like he's, conniving here? Yes. Well, you have all these paintings with very erect nipples and lots of naked bodies, and he doesn't seem to be saying no to the wine or to whatever is going on. Then, of course, there's the fox, Vulpinus, the image of covetous lust. There's the fox, and there's Lot's wife, the pillar of salt with the burning of the city. So we have that story of the destruction of Lot and basically morally. Now, I want to move, though, to something else. I think we have time. We're doing pretty well today, but let's now take our break, shall we? Let's take our break. Leaving you with this horrible, incestuous image. Let's take our break. Shall we continue on? I put this image up very quickly just before we took our break. If you think of one of the most important, almost sacramental institutions in Judaism, the part of that idea of a covenant of circumcision, we know very well that circumcision was practiced in Old Kingdom Egypt for a long time, at least a millennium before whenever Moses might have been. And here you can see from the necropolis of Saqqara circumcision taking place. And there's a text that goes with it which basically says, do it fast. But these are on adolescents, and I don't think that's a good idea. Anyway, I think the Hebrew idea of doing it before there's a lot of cognition in an infant. I'm not saying there isn't pain. I'm just saying that an infant can do far less about it. But anyway, can you imagine this ritual? What we now know medically and those of you who are doctors, and I know there are plenty of you out there, there was a book by S.I. McMillan, None of These Diseases, that came out 30 years ago, which has maybe received mixed response more recently, but a lot of medical doctors can confirm that foreskin on males increases a lot of bacterial growth, and there's a correlation between high bacterial growth and smegma with cervical cancer in women. So that circumcision appears to be a not only benign but medically good thing to do because it reduces some of the likelihood of cervical cancer. Now, if some of you who have heard this or read this or know this already, could I just see confirmation of those who know this? And medical doctors in the room who know this too, yes? Yeah, so it's well known, but not many people realize that circumcision was practiced in ancient Egypt, and particularly important in ancient Egypt along the Nile, where in a subtropical environment with the bacteria growth around the Nile, phenomenal high rates of septicity. So it's very possible that the Egyptians figured this out. We know from their medical knowledge that sometimes they were really prescient, and they had plenty of evidence to see this. I could go into a lot of detail. I think I taught here a few years ago, Medicine in the Ancient World, did I not? And you may recall a lot of ideas from the Smith Papyrus and the Leiden Papyrus and others about Egyptian medicine. But let's not go there, but let's think about Egypt for a bit, shall we? Because one of the questions that's always asked with any kind of ideas on archaeology and the Bible is this question of Exodus, which, by the way, you know Exodus is a Greek word. The word hodos, or odos, O-D-O-S or O-D-H-O-S, odos, is the word for road or way. And X means out, so it's the way out. And if you went to ancient theaters, I was just in a lot of Greek theaters a few weeks ago, and there's always this gateway to the side of a theater, to a double gateway, and it's where the chorus exits. It's the exodos, the way out. And the two doors are often called the parados, because it's a processional way out for the chorus, who sing and dance and then go out, come back in, sing and dance, go out. So we get our word parade from parados, this ceremonial procession. Now, Exodus. It's a huge question that a lot of minimalists have said, humbug. No such possibility. But I want to turn your eyes to this. Somebody asked just a minute ago where they could read about this Ashkenazi, Turkish source. This was just in the news yesterday, and I was given it because I'm on an academic notification list. I have it on my email account, but it's not probably all that accessible yet, but it's going to come out in the full press probably within a week, if it hasn't already. Did anybody else read about this? No. Okay. So what I will try to do is, if there's an email list for this class, I'll give it to one of the persons in staff, and I'll send you the link for this. And I've already sent this out to friends who are geneticists and say, what do you think? And so far, it looks pretty good that part of the migrations of the Jews went through Anatolia. And multiple times this has happened. But anyway, I'll send you that link. But here you can read an article, which is pretty good. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. It's in the Israeli publication Haaretz, the land or the earth. And it was just a few days ago. Were Hebrews ever slaves in ancient Egypt? And the answer is yes. according to them. And I do not find it in the least bit incredible. Now, just to give a little background to this, you probably already know that Thebes was the capital of New Kingdom Egypt. But Memphis, Saqqara, Giza, this was the capital of Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom Egypt. And we're talking that roughly from 3000 BCE to roughly 1800 BCE, this was the capital. And then there was an invasion into Egypt by a group called the Hyksos, Hyksos. They were Semitic. They were from this area called Canaan, the coastland. And they came in and they lived in the delta. Tanis and Avaris are two sites associated with them. But what happened, they took over the delta area. They populated the land and took over this area. And there was this fracture, this big rift between Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. So the capital was moved from the sort of metroplex of Giza, Memphis, Saqqara, the capital, since they no longer controlled this. The Egyptians who were not subjugated moved upriver to Thebes, and so the New Kingdom Egypt became the capital for much of the New Kingdom. Then in the 16th century, Ahmose, now that's the beginning of the New Kingdom, came and basically kicked them out and conquered them and sent them out again. So we have this tension between Semites in Upper Egypt, Egyptians in Upper Egypt and Semites in Lower Egypt. And quite a few of the different reactions and actions and behavioral relationships between the two is that there was often enslavement going on back and forth on the margins of these conflicts. So, slavery in Egypt is the context of the book of Exodus. Question, Terrence.
That was the one time that somebody like Joseph could have come in.
Exactly.
He was a foreigner.
Exactly.
Put in with
Let me repeat the question, or Terrence comment. This is the time when Joseph could have come in as a vizier.
exiles.
And so there are some opportunities for people to discuss this. But the Egyptians would be never very likely to accept a tradition that showed they had been overcome temporarily or at least matched temporarily by a different people. Let me point you to up here at Kadesh. Kadesh is right up here. There was the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 when the Hittites of Anatolia came 1,000 miles down, and Ramses the Great, Ramses II, came 1,000 miles up, and they met at Kadesh, which was on the east-west trade route and the north-south trade route. The Battle of Kadesh, 1274 BCE, was essentially a stalemate. But Ramses comes back home and describes it as a total victory and says he slew 100,000 Hittites. Well, you go back to the Istanbul Museum and look at the treaty that came about 15 years later from that, and you read the Hittite account, and they don't match at all. In fact, what happens is, although Thutmose III, 3 centuries earlier, had been up in this region with Egyptian hegemony. Remember last week I told you there's always been this back and forth between Mesopotamia and Egypt. When Mesopotamia controls this area, you see a lot of Mesopotamian cuneiform seals and so on. But when Egypt controls this area, you see a lot of scarabs and Egyptian motifs. So it's this constant ebb and flow, and that's why this has been called the land between. But in the 13th century, 1274, this battle of Kadesh, the Egyptians totally leave this area and they don't ever retain any presence there. All Egyptian motifs, presence artifacts disappear, and instead Hittite artifacts take over. So Ramses' account glorifying his victory over the Hittites is basically seen as complete propaganda. And of course, if you're his scribe, you're going to write down what he says, right? Or, So the account of Egypt says they won. The account of Hittites say there was a battle. They don't say who won, but the Hittite material culture takes over. So the fact that now this area is controlled by the archaeological record of the north and Hittites suggests that Ramses is going to go back and tell his people, who, unless you're one of his persons who was on the campaign with him, you're not going to know the difference. He's going to tell his people that he had a glorious victory under his god Amun and so on. So the Egyptians we see this many times in Egypt's textual accounts, that they claim more than really they should. They propagandize this. So historians have often said, if there was an exodus when the Egyptians were temporarily matched or even in some way let a whole slave population escape with the goods, the Egyptians are likely to suppress it based on experience with Ramses and many other accounts. So you can go look this up. It's very easy to find on the internet. And as I said, it's pretty good. But there are a lot of things that we can cite for potential evidence to suggest that the Exodus account of slavery is accurate and of a Semitic presence in the Delta. And if you read, if you read Exodus 1 through 3, if you read even Genesis, you'll find that there's a time period when, under famine, people flock to Egypt because the Nile River is this river of life, and unless the river itself dries up, if there's famine around, you can grow 3 crops of whatever, wheat or spelt, in the Nile per year, because you have about 360 days plus of sunshine. You've got plenty of water, and it's getting this constant inundation of nutrients and humus, not hummus, humus, getting lots of nutrients coming down the river. So the annual inundation fertilized the fields. So Egypt was known as a land of plenty. So we do know that one of the first incursions of Semitics into the land was due to famine in the north. So again, there's a possibility of a kind of a synchronicity of accounts with the sons of Judah who go down to Egypt, and then this possible Semitic vizier Joseph. Now, I'm going to come back to that, but here, for example, you have near Beni Hassan in Thebes. This is in the north. This is Upper Egypt now. But you have this account of Semites. They're clearly not Egyptians. Look at the little beards they have. Egyptians don't have enough hair follicles on their face in ancient Egypt to grow beards. It's part of their DNA. Very low hair follicle on the face in ancient Egypt. Plus, also, the ancient Egyptians had a lot of red melanin pigment in their skin. And the current residents of Egypt are not the ancient residents of Egypt. The current residents are mostly Arabic. It's the Copts who are the ancient Egyptians. That's been proven now in DNA. It's also, if you look at the pure Copts, that word Koptos is part of their source. When Christianity came in to Egypt in the late Roman era, the ancient Egyptians who Christianized, they kept their sort of DNA intact for a long time, and there's still a lot of fairly red-skinned Copts who speak also Coptic, which is basically ancient Egyptian mixed with Greek. That's not Arabic. And so what often happens is that you can see that the Copts are the residual leftover of ancient Egypt. And here in this picture, I'm going to show you a reproduction of it, but it shows the Semites coming from Egypt, roughly 1900 to 1800 BCE. The usual date for this Beni Hassan tomb, the tomb of Khnumhotep II, is usually around 1800 BCE. So here's a reproduction of it. And even though it's rendered in an Egyptianized way, do you see the beards? Those are not Egyptians. And they're also, their garb is a woolen sort of plaid. These may be Egyptians here or Egyptianized Hyksos wearing Egyptian clothes, but these are clearly not Egyptian clothes. And the animals they're bringing are not Egyptian. They're animals from Canaan. The goods are Canaanite. The instruments, everything that's shown here is coming from the northeast of the land of Canaan. So whoever it is, it shows people, and look at even the shoes and sandals. These are not Egyptian clothes, they're not Egyptian shoes, etc., etc., etc. So whether it's the Semites or whether it's the Hyksos, it really doesn't matter. It shows a presence from Canaan in Egypt. Now, there are lots of texts about slavery, and even though these two images don't show the whips of the masters, here is an earlier, well, this is a later text actually. Here, a leather scroll describes a close account of brickmaking, apparently by enslaved prisoners of war from Canaan and Syria. Sounds very much like the biblical account. 40 taskmasters, each with a daily target of 2,000 bricks, which is pretty parallel to the Exodus account. Then there are two Egyptian papyri, the Anastasia 3 and 4. They describe straw being put in bricks. And the reason why you put straw in bricks is for tempering process. When you bake the brick, what happens? The straw burns and it kind of mini fires the area around it. So straw in bricks is practical. But interesting, here Exodus says, there's a little metathesis there, but let them go gather straw for themselves. Then there's another Egyptian papyrus, Bologna 1094, tells workers who fled their taskmaster because he beat them. So there are plenty of residual sort of ancillary accounts that show both brick making by slaves and oppression by masters of slaves roughly parallels the accounts of Exodus about brickmaking. And in fact, the two cities mentioned in Exodus are the cities of the Delta, Pi-Rathom, and also near Tanis. So that it again correlates to that Hyksos Semitic presence. This is just one little bit of evidence. I better hurry up here. Now eventually, the new kingdom starts when Amos defeats the Hyksos and kicks them out of Egypt altogether, which is roughly, this is the beginning of what we call Dynasty 17 and 18, and the Dynasty 18 is the Amenhotep dynasty. You have Amenhotep the first, you have, of course, Thutmose the first, Thutmose the second, Hatshepsut, Thutmose the third, Thutmose the fourth, but then you get Amenhotep the third, and then his son, Amenhotep the fourth, who changes his name. Now, look at these. Here's somebody very interesting. You all know that King Tut, we all say Tutankhamun, yes? This was his father, Amenhotep IV, who renamed himself Akhenaten. Now, at birth, the name of Tut was actually Tutankhaten. It wasn't Tutankhamun. He only changed his name under heavy pressure from the resurgent Theban priesthood of Amun, fearing for his life. So this is the son, literally, Tutankhaten, who changed his name to Tutankhamun, is the son of the heretic king. Now we know some interesting things. There was an article in Biblioteca Sacra in 1984 by Charles Dyer suggesting that Akhenaten, the heretic king who becomes a quasi-monotheist, is an intriguing person in history because he forsakes the Theban dominance of the god Amun of Thebes. He builds his own city down the river at Amarna. He worships the Aten, kind of a singularity. It's not monotheism, but Charlie Dyer said, intriguingly, we know that Amenhotep III, his father, had an older son who didn't survive. And Akhenaten is the second son who survives. You could read that. It's very well researched. Mind you, it's conservative. But Akhenaten, the heretic king, all these pieces that we have that are from the Louvre, they've all been shattered and put back together again in the French, in the Louvre. If you look closely, you can see all the breaks. Akhenaten's record was destroyed as much as possible. And his mother's, even his mother's statues were destroyed. Queen Tai, the wife of Amenhotep III. So Charles Dyer makes a case that the Exodus corresponds to a lot of the details about this time of Akhenaten. But Tutankhamun, whose name was Tutankhaten, we have it for sure from his birth records and early material that you can see in the Cairo Museum. There's so much civil war and unrest that King Tut's tomb is lost. There's complete chaos in the society. And what happens, according to some like Charles Dyer, is that the chaos and the rejection of Akhenaten's entire reign as this heretic king who worships only kind of one god, the hatred and the venom which derogates his reign may have destroyed some of the records of this Exodus. Now, I'm not going to say it's true. I'm just saying you can find ancillary evidence. Here are three additional things that might be appropriate. In 1987, a team of French archaeologists discovered the tomb of a man called Aper-El or Aper-Yah, both names. And the end of the name suggests that he worships the Hebrew god Yah or El, which would not be an Egyptian pantheon of gods at all. And he's a commander of the charioteers, and he's vizier to Amenhotep III and to his son Akhenaten, which is intriguing that you have somebody with apparently a partly Hebrew name. Then the second one, Papyrus Anastasia VI, this is from 1200 BC, describes how Egyptian authorities allowed a group of Semitic nomads from Edom who worshipped Yahweh to pass the border fortress in the region of the Wadi Tumilat. They worshipped Yahweh. And then proceeded with their livestock to the lakes of Pithom, which is in the delta. This is known material too. Thirdly, there is a text called the Admonitions of Impuwer, or the Lord of All, that it portrays Egypt in a very bad period, a real downturn, haunted by plagues, droughts, violent uprising, and it culminates with an escape of slaves. It doesn't quantify the amount of slaves. Now, the Hebrews text in Exodus says 600,000 people left. The problem with that number is that the word Eleph, which is the word for thousand in Hebrew, can actually be a space marker which could not mean 1,000 at all. It could be a much smaller number. There's a little ambiguity with Eleph. Whatever the case, if a group of slaves left with Egypt's wealth, and if it may correlate, this is the early date Exodus, around 1440 BCE or so, that it correlates to Akhenaten's life. And intriguingly, if you added up a lot of the numbers in the book of Judges, when it says, after 300 years in the land, this and this happened. And this is in Judges 11, which suggests, if this is around 1100, that the Exodus an early date exodus would be around the 15th century BCE. That's Kenneth Kitchen's suggestion also, whereas the majority view falls with Sir Matthew William Flinders Petrie, that it's under Ramses II in the 13th century, 1290 BCE. So you have these two Exodus possible dates, but it's intriguing to consider that Akhenaten, the heretic king who seems to worship only the Aten, and here he is with his wife, Nefertiti, and notice there is the sun with the extending benevolence of the hand of the Aten, and as I said, remember one of the sons is Tutankhaten, who is forced to change his name out of fear for his life. Even his mother, her statues were destroyed. You can see Queen Tai, who may have been the most beautiful woman in Egypt. I don't say this in front of my wife too often, but I say those are really kissable lips. But this is yellow jasper, which is really hard stone. But the entire legacy of Akhenaten was destroyed. And King Tut, his son, dies. We're not exactly sure how. There are a lot of competing theories. Whatever the case, the Egyptians are unlikely to, in this chaos that follows, to preserve an account of escaped slaves making off with the goods. So all I'm suggesting is, while Egypt, with its propagandistic accounts grandizing itself, would never be likely to describe this exodus of slaves, there are ancillary evidences that suggest the conditions described in Exodus correlate to the conditions described in Egypt time and again. So, was there an Exodus? Time may tell. 2 years ago, I read about a discovery on the Reed Sea, called now the Red Sea, where a bunch of chariots were found from a battle. And it has not yet been excavated, and it's not likely to happen since Egypt is probably not going to look favorably on an archaeological project that proves the Exodus. Might this even be true? So the jury is still out on this question about the Exodus. But thank you. I've gone over again. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.